In the heart of Mississippi, 1852, stood a plantation cloaked in wealth and in whispers. Its owner, a man of ruthless ambition, commanded both land and lives. But behind closed doors, his cruelty reached beyond profit. For his daughter, hidden away from society and burdened by shame, he devised a fate so disturbing that even the enslaved whispered in horror. This is not just a tale of power. It is a tale of control, humiliation, and the legacy of a family consumed by its own darkness. The plantation stretched across miles of fertile Mississippi soil. A sprawling empire of cotton fields and oak lined paths that seemed to whisper with the weight of history. To the outside world, it was a place of prosperity, a symbol of Southern wealth and dominance, its master praised for his influence and admired for the grandeur of his estate. But beneath the polished veneer of Southern gentility lay a darkness that could not be seen from the outside. The house itself loomed large, its white columns stark against the endless green, a monument not to grace, but to control and possession. Servants and enslaved laborers moved quietly through its halls and yards, every action measured, every word weighed. For the presence of the master was one that demanded obedience, not merely out of respect, but out of fear. The man at the center of this dominion was feared as much as he was respected. He was a man who thrived on authority, who saw people as assets and bodies as currency. The wealth he accumulated was not simply through the cotton that grew on his land, but through the careful manipulation of power and the cruel enjoyment of dominance over others. In town, he was greeted with nods and forced smiles, but behind closed doors, whispers circulated about his temper, his indulgences, and his secret cruelties. Yet no one dared challenge him, for his influence reached deep into the courts and the church, and silence was often the safest choice for survival. At the center of this vast household was his daughter, a young woman rarely seen by outsiders. She was described as awkward, plain, and burdened with a body that drew ridicule in a society obsessed with appearances. She remained mostly hidden from public view, confined within the plantation walls, her existence both shielded and controlled by her father. To him, she was not a child to protect, but a vessel to command, her life measured against his ambitions and the preservation of his family name. Within the walls of the great house, she was an object of pity to some, of ridicule to others, and of cold indifference to the man who called himself her protector. Shadows lingered in every corner of her life, shadows born not of her own making, but of the household she belonged to, and the cruel authority that determined her fate. The daughter's isolation was not accidental, but carefully orchestrated by her father, who viewed her as both a weakness and a burden. In a society where women were currency for alliances, marriage, and reputation, she was a piece he could not easily play on the social chessboard. While other planners proudly paraded their daughters at dances, adorned in silks and ribbons, she was kept hidden behind the curtains of the great house. Invitations were politely declined, appearances avoided, and excuses made about her health or temperament. Yet those who had glimpsed her remembered the sight, a figure marked by heaviness, with a gaze that rarely met another's eyes, as though she already knew she did not belong in the world that judged her. Within the house, her daily life became a rhythm of confinement. She moved from her room to the parlor, from the parlor to the shaded veranda, her presence shadowed by maids and watched by her father's silent judgment. Conversations about her future were not held in her presence, but behind locked doors where her father weighed possibilities not of affection or compatibility, but of control and inheritance. Suitors were considered, quickly dismissed, or never informed at all, for no man of his standing wished to tie his lineage to a woman who did not fit society's cruel standards. She was both daughter and prisoner, existing within the walls of her father's empire, as if she were another possession, valuable only if he could devise a way to make her so. Her loneliness grew heavier with each passing season, for while she was cut off from society, she was not spared the knowledge of its scorn. She heard the whispers carried back by servants, the cruel laughter of neighbors spoken just loud enough to wound, the remarks of rejection that reduced her existence to a blemish on her father's pride. Even within her own home, she was not spared humiliation. Some of the enslaved pitied her. Others despised the arrogance she displayed when trying to assert what little authority she could over them, and all knew that her life was as tightly bound in her father's fist as theirs was. Yet the true cruelty lay in the way she was made to believe her worthlessness, not as a consequence of her own nature, but as the design of a man who saw no purpose for her, unless it could serve his will. The plantation owner's mind was not one to accept defeat, even when it came to matters of blood and family legacy. The rejection of his daughter by society, the failure to secure her a respectable marriage, gnawed at him like a personal insult. For a man accustomed to bending others to his will, the idea that his own flesh and blood could not be molded into an asset was intolerable. He began to see her not as a disappointment to be hidden, but as a problem to be solved, a vessel whose usefulness could be forced into existence. The solution he conceived was not born of compassion or paternal duty, but of cold calculation and cruelty, a scheme that would both punish her for her inadequacies and satisfy his own twisted sense of control. In his eyes, wealth and power gave him the right to decide the fate of anyone beneath his roof, and his daughter was no exception. He considered the enslaved men under his ownership as instruments, their bodies subject to his command as surely as their labor in the fields. What he envisioned for his daughter was an arrangement that would bypass the conventions of society entirely. If no man of status would have her, then he would make her useful in his own way, ensuring that heirs bearing his bloodline would exist, regardless of how they came to be. It was, in his mind, a business decision cloaked in secrecy, one that would never be spoken of beyond the walls of the plantation. The cruelty of the plan lay not only in its execution, but in the complete disregard for the humanity of those involved. His daughter's will was irrelevant, her body treated as a tool to be directed toward his purpose. The enslaved men who would be chosen were not partners but victims of coercion, stripped of agency and forced into roles that deepened their chains. He saw none of this as cruelty, only as inevitability, a display of the absolute power he believed was his by right. To him, morality was a fiction for the weak, and reputation was all that mattered. If he could conceal the truth while securing the heirs he demanded, then the means were justified. He began making preparations quietly, speaking in guarded tones to those he trusted least, arranging the circumstances with the precision of a man accustomed to bending every life around him to his design. The search for participants in his scheme was carried out in the shadows, cloaked in secrecy and calculated persuasion. The plantation owner knew he could not risk involving men of his own class, for whispers spread quickly among the wealthy, and scandal was a threat he could never allow. Instead, he turned his gaze downward, toward those whose desperation could be exploited, and whose silence could be bought or enforced. Among the enslaved, there were men of strength and youth, their lives already claimed by his authority, their bodies treated as tools for labor. They were convenient, controlled, and easily threatened into compliance. Yet even as he viewed them as suitable choices, he understood the need to maintain absolute discretion, for discovery would bring ruin not only upon his daughter, but upon his entire legacy. Promises of favor or threats of punishment became the currency with which he recruited. Some men were lured with the false hope of lighter duties or small privileges, while others were coerced under the weight of his threats, knowing that refusal could mean a fate far worse than compliance. The cruel paradox was that each man understood his lack of choice, that even supposed rewards were only another form of control. Their silence was demanded, their consent irrelevant. The weight of fear ensured their compliance, and the master believed his plan was unshakable. At the same time, the daughter was given little explanation, only commands presented as inevitabilities. She was told what to expect with a coldness that stripped away any illusion of agency, her protests silenced before they could form into words. Her isolation made resistance impossible, for there was nowhere to run, no one to confide in, and no power greater than the will of her father. Even the household staff, who suspected fragments of the truth, dared not interfere. Whispers carried from one servant to another, but they never reached beyond the plantation gates, bound in place by fear of the man whose wrath had ruined lives for far less. In the quiet corners of the estate, where shadows stretched long in the moonlight and the fields stood silent, the arrangements began to take shape. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement of the humanity of those involved, only the ruthless orchestration of a man who believed himself untouchable. Every detail was controlled, every risk considered, yet beneath the surface lingered an unease, a sense that what was being forced into existence carried with it a weight that could not remain hidden forever. The daughter's compliance was never a matter of choice, but of survival under the gaze of their domineering father. Raised in a household where obedience was demanded and rebellion swiftly crushed, they had been conditioned from childhood to submit to his will. His word carried the weight of law, his disapproval a punishment more suffocating than any physical blow. They lived within walls where silence was safer than speech and resistance meant humiliation or worse. When his plan was revealed, it did not arrive as a request but as a decree spoken with the same finality used when commanding the fields or dictating business. For the daughters, protest was futile, for their lives had never truly belonged to them. Each daughter carried her own burden of fear and shame. One withdrew into a kind of numb acceptance, convincing herself that submission was the only way to endure what could not be escaped. Another clung to fragile hope, believing perhaps that if she obeyed, her father's cruelty might soften, though deep down she knew it never would. Their silence was not agreement, but a desperate attempt to preserve themselves within the narrow space left to them. To speak against him would mean being crushed under the full weight of his authority, and so their words remained locked behind trembling lips. Yet the cost of their compliance grew heavier with each passing day. The knowledge of what was expected of them pressed down like a stone, reshaping their sense of self. The humiliation of being treated as objects rather than women with futures of their own carved deep wounds into their spirits. They began to see themselves through their father's cold eyes, not as daughters to be cherished, but as vessels to be used. Within their private moments, they wrestled with shame, anger, and despair, emotions they could never safely voice. Even their bond with one another, fragile and necessary, was strained under the weight of the secret they were forced to carry. The enslaved men, chosen for the task, bore their own anguish, but the daughter's compliance was its mirror, each side of the arrangement bound by coercion and fear. The household around them seemed to conspire in silence, with servants turning their faces away, unwilling to acknowledge what they suspected. The plantation itself became a stage for cruelty disguised as duty, where each daughter's obedience was demanded not only by her father's command, but by a society that granted him the right to decide her worth. Whispers began to ripple through Boston's elite circles, carried on the breath of servants, hinted at in the corners of drawing rooms, and disguised as idle gossip at gatherings. The widow had always commanded respect with her wealth and social influence, but her sudden secrecy and the peculiar circumstances surrounding her daughters drew unwanted attention. Neighbors noticed that young men of modest means were seen coming and going at odd hours, often slipping through side entrances rather than the grand front door. These visits, though discreet, did not escape the sharp eyes of a society that thrived on speculation. Soon, questions arose that no polite conversation could silence. Why were the daughters rarely seen in public anymore? Why had their prospects for marriage grown so dim, despite their mother's fortune? The city was a place where appearances were currency, and the faintest hint of impropriety could unravel carefully constructed reputations. Women whispered behind gloved hands at luncheons, their words dripping with curiosity and veiled malice. Men exchanged knowing looks at private clubs, too wary to speak openly but eager to share suspicions in hushed tones. The widow herself, long skilled at managing her public persona, sensed the unease pressing in from all sides. She answered with calculated gestures of normalcy, generous donations to the church, extravagant dinners where nothing unusual appeared amiss, carefully staged appearances at theaters and operas. Yet beneath the surface, the doubts only grew stronger. The daughters bore the heaviest burden of these whispers, for even without explicit accusations, the air around them seemed charged with unspoken judgment. They were watched more closely whenever they did appear in public, every glance, every hesitant smile, every subtle change in their figure dissected by those who sought confirmation of their suspicions. For the young men involved, silence was not as easily purchased as the widow hoped. Poverty made them vulnerable, but pride and fear made them dangerous. Some spoke in confidence to friends, sharing fragments of truth that spread like wildfire once passed from one mouth to another. The servants of the household, bound by both loyalty and fear, became unwilling participants in maintaining the facade. They knew that a single misplaced word could destroy them, yet the truth pressed on their consciences with unbearable weight. What began as faint whispers became threads of rumor weaving themselves into the fabric of Boston society, threatening at any moment to unravel the carefully constructed secrecy the widow clung to. The price of silence grew heavier with each passing week, as the delicate balance the widow had created threatened to tip beneath the weight of rumor and betrayal. She understood that money was the only shield she possessed against exposure, and so she wielded it with calculated precision. To the young men who had played their roles in her secret design, she offered more than the original sum promised, pressing coins into their hands with a warning look that left no doubt about the consequences of loose tongues. Some accepted greedily, convincing themselves that secrecy was worth the price, while others hesitated, troubled by the shame of their involvement. For them, the temptation to confess lingered like a shadow, a way to cleanse themselves of guilt, and the widow knew this danger well. Her strategy extended beyond payment. Threats, subtle and unspoken, were layered into every transaction. The young men were reminded of their place, of how easily a whisper could be turned back against them, of how society would never take their word over the widows. Fear of ruin kept many silent where money alone might have failed. Yet the widow was not content to rely on fear alone. She staged acts of generosity within the community, hoping to smother suspicion beneath public displays of virtue. She gave alms to the church, funded repairs to the orphanage, and hosted lavish gatherings designed to distract from the questions that simmered beneath Boston's polished veneer. The daughters, meanwhile, carried their own silence like a burden stitched into their very skin. Their compliance was not purchased but forced, their fear of their mother's authority binding them more tightly than any coin. They learned to mask their shame beneath blank expressions, to endure the scrutinizing gazes of neighbors without betraying the truth that gnawed at their spirits. Servants, too, became part of the unspoken pact, bound by a mixture of loyalty, fear, and the occasional bribe slipped quietly into their hands. Every corner of the household was drawn into the conspiracy, every life touched by the widow's relentless determination to preserve the secret. But silence was never absolute, and each payment, each threat, each forced smile only deepened the fragile web she had woven. The more she paid to keep the truth hidden, the more she realized how unstable her control truly was, for every soul bound by secrecy also carried the potential to betray her. And every act of concealment left another trace of the scandal she so desperately sought to erase. The first signs of pregnancy within the household could not be concealed forever, no matter how carefully the widow planned or how much she demanded silence. The daughters, once shielded from society by excuses of frailty or illness, began to show the undeniable evidence of their condition. Loose gowns and withdrawn appearances could only disguise so much before observant eyes noticed the subtle changes. Servants, already aware of whispers within the household, carried the knowledge in their glances, in the way their voices lowered when the daughters passed, in the unease that rippled through corridors once filled with quiet routine. Though they dared not speak openly, the truth was evident to anyone who lived close enough to witness it. The widow faced this new reality with a stern resolve, determined to frame the situation as providence rather than scandal. She crafted stories of secret betrothals, of arrangements not yet announced to the public, of alliances forming quietly behind closed doors. These explanations were meant to soothe society's curiosity, but in Boston's tightly knit circles, such tales only sparked further speculation. How could respectable engagements remain so hidden? Why were no suitors ever seen in the company of the daughters, no visits exchanged, no rings displayed? The inconsistencies were too glaring for the curious to ignore. The daughters themselves bore the heaviest weight of exposure. Stripped of dignity and consumed by the fear of judgment, they retreated further into isolation, their lives reduced to waiting and enduring. For some, the reality of carrying a child stirred conflicting emotions. Terror, shame, but also a strange awareness that the lives within them, however conceived, might become the only companions in their forced solitude. Their mother spoke little of tenderness, focusing instead on the necessity of heirs and the preservation of the family name. The daughters' own voices were drowned out by her will, their feelings dismissed as irrelevant, compared to the legacy she sought to secure. Beyond the household walls, rumors thickened like smoke. Neighbors speculated in hushed tones, their suspicions gaining strength as visible evidence replaced shadowy gossip. For the young men involved, the pregnancies were both proof of their compliance and a new source of danger. For the existence of children bound them more tightly to the secret than ever before. Each heartbeat growing within the daughters was not only a sign of life, but a reminder of the scandal pulsing at the center of the widow's carefully constructed facade, a scandal that could no longer be fully hidden even under the weight of wealth and influence. The fragile secrecy the widow had fought so desperately to maintain began to unravel when betrayal crept in from the very men she had relied upon. Among those paid for their silence, one carried resentment like a festering wound. The coins he had received were quickly spent, and the shame of his actions gnawed at him in private. To free himself from guilt, or perhaps to profit further, he began to speak. At first it was only to a confidant, but words once released refused to remain confined. They slipped into taverns, into alleyways, into corners where Boston's working men gathered, and from there spread like wildfire into the very circles the widow feared most. Rumor hardened into accusation, and whispers took on names, places, and details that could not be dismissed as idle talk. The widow, long accustomed to controlling narratives, found herself chasing shadows she could no longer catch. She attempted once more to silence the betrayer with promises of more gold, but greed had already taken root. He demanded more than she could provide, and when she hesitated, his bitterness deepened into a hunger for revenge. To expose her was no longer merely about money. It became a way to wound the woman who had treated him as nothing more than a tool. The daughters, now marked by their condition, became living evidence of the scandal. Their every appearance in public drew stares that could not be ignored, their withdrawn demeanor only fueling suspicions. The widow tried to shield them with stories of engagements arranged in secrecy, but the betrayal had already stripped her excuses bare. Those who once whispered now spoke openly of disgrace, and the family name, once untouchable, began to rot under the weight of gossip. Within the household, fear and tension thickened into something unbearable. Servants knew the truth was no longer safely hidden and worried what would become of them if the household collapsed in scandal. The young men who had remained silent grew restless, wondering how long before they too were exposed. The widow herself felt the walls closing in, her fortune bleeding away in her efforts to contain the damage. What had once seemed a calculated and controlled scheme now revealed itself as a crumbling edifice, each stone loosened by betrayal, each secret threatened by the mouths of those she could no longer control. Chapter unfolds in the shadow of collapse, where the widow's determination finally collided with the unforgiving weight of truth. The betrayals and whispers that had plagued her household for months hardened into something undeniable, spreading beyond the taverns and parlors to become the talk of Boston. Neighbors no longer speculated in hushed tones, they whispered with certainty, and even those who once feared her influence began to turn away. The facade of wealth and dignity she had so carefully maintained cracked beneath the gaze of a society that thrived on judgment. Her daughters, burdened by pregnancies that could no longer be hidden, became unwilling symbols of scandal. Every step they took outside the house was met with stares and muttered condemnation, their names tarnished before they had ever been given the chance to secure their futures. The widow tried to wield her wealth one last time as a weapon. She offered bribes to silence gossip. She lavished gifts upon the church, and she attempted to buy loyalty from those who had once been her closest allies. Yet the more she spent, the weaker her position grew, for money could not erase what the eyes of Boston had already seen. The very power she believed would protect her only made her downfall more spectacular, for the community viewed her with a mixture of fascination and contempt, reveling in the downfall of a woman who had always kept herself above them. Inside her household, tension swelled into quiet despair. Servants feared for their positions, knowing that scandal might cost them their livelihoods. The daughters, trapped between obedience and humiliation, began to resent their mother's iron grip, though they lacked the strength to defy her openly. Their compliance had been forced, their silence bought not with coin but with fear, and as their conditions advanced, they began to see their lives not as their own, but as sacrifices upon the altar of their mother's ambition. For them, the future held little promise, only a legacy defined by the choices of another. The young men who had been part of the widow's scheme were no longer silent. Some spoke openly of their involvement, their voices fueled by bitterness or a desperate attempt to unburden themselves. Their confessions tore apart what little secrecy remained, painting the widow not only as a manipulator, but as a woman who had defied the moral fabric of her society in ways that could never be forgiven. The scandal became too large to contain, echoing through newspapers in veiled references, whispered about in church pews, and carried across Boston like a storm that refused to pass. The widow herself, once formidable and untouchable, became a figure of isolation. Invitations ceased to arrive, her presence at gatherings no longer welcome but shunned. She withdrew into her house on Beacon Hill, her wealth still vast but her influence reduced to ashes. The grandeur of her halls and the glitter of her possessions became meaningless in the absence of respect, and the silence within her home grew heavier than the whispers outside ever had been. Her name, once spoken with admiration, was now a cautionary tale told in tones of judgment, a reminder of the dangers of pride and ambition when left unchecked by morality. The daughters eventually bore children, their lives reshaped entirely by the scandal that had consumed them. For some, the children became both burden and solace, a constant reminder of their mother's schemes, but also a spark of life in an existence otherwise defined by shame. The widow clung to them as proof that her plan had succeeded in the most literal sense, For her bloodline was extended, though at a cost so devastating it left her legacy forever stained. In the end, the wealthy widow of Boston 1852 was remembered not for her fortune, her grandeur, or her influence, but for the scandal she orchestrated in her desperate bid to control fate. Her story was carried on in whispers long after her death, a reminder of how secrets unravel, how ambition corrupts, and how even the most carefully guarded facades will eventually crumble when built upon deception. Her daughters lived in the long shadow of her choices, their names etched not into the society pages of Boston's elite, but into its darker folklore, remembered as victims of a scheme that could not withstand the judgment of time. Thank you for listening to this chilling and tragic story from Boston's past. History is often shaped not only by the triumphs of families, but also by the scandals that expose their flaws. I hope this tale left you thinking about how far people will go to preserve power, legacy, and reputation. Your support means the world, and I look forward to sharing more stories that uncover the hidden and unsettling corners of history. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and thank you for being here.